Hi and good morning and happy Sunday to you. My name is Tashieanna O'Connor, and today we have Troy Hassan with us. He's going to tell us a little bit of the story about what it's like being a single dad and the struggle and the challenges that he faced, whether it's with the court system or with his mom, and how he could help our listeners that, you could benefit from it. And Troy,
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Appreciate that.
just tell us a little bit about yourself, about what it's like being a single dad, what the struggles and the challenges that you face, and what some of the encouragement you could give our single fathers out there, and whether they've been abused physically, financially, mentally, how the court system works, how they treat you, how are stuff that you go through, and just all the challenges, and especially when it comes on to if you don't have the support for the care system, for daycares, and how you manage between the school and work and so on. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, one, first of all, being a parent is a true blessing from God. You know what I mean? So
Amen.
that's a responsibility that you must take on at full throttle if that is something that is your desire to be. So you don't take any of those sorts of things for granted. One. And then the challenges are, as men, sometimes they don't give us the opportunities to bear the burden of being a parent. They try to take that opportunity away from you or lessen our role as a parent because we're fathers. You know what I mean? So those are some of the challenges within itself. Letting people know that you are really actively involved in the everyday life of child rearing, of raising your children and stuff like that. It just don't. You're just not a financial aspect to a child. You don't want to just be considered the financial resource to your children. You want to be involved in their everyday upbringing. With putting them to sleep, waking them up for school, providing breakfast, lunch, dinner, weekend trips, things like that. Things that mothers do on a regular, but because they are mothers, they think we should not then bear those same opportunities or responsibilities. But you have to really take it upon yourself to make that a conscious effort to do so through all the struggles, through all the fighting of your role and your position. Don't succumb to just letting it be, or because they think, or because they say this is not your role. You should now just give in and say, well, forget it. This is all I'm going to do. Fathers can do a lot. Fathers have opportunities to do a lot and be a real resource to their child's development. Yeah, so for me, something that manifested when I was young. I always said my children will live with me no matter what the situation with me and the mother would be. We would hopefully that the relationship with the parents collectively would be something that you guys both could work through and do together. But if it doesn't happen, do you now leave the situation? Do you now leave your children because you and the mother don't work out? No. You stand tall, you stand strong, and your convictions of being a parent and being a dad is something totally different than just being a father. See, being a father, anybody can be a father. You know what I mean? You can have children and you can leave your child all over the world and, you know, plant your seeds all over. You're a father.
Right.
That does not mean you're a dad. See, and that's what I want men to understand. Dad's roles are totally different than a father's role. You know,
Amen.
father come and go, come in when he wants to. He could pop in when he wants to. He could sometimes never show up. That's a father. But
Right.
a dad's gonna have real concerns about their child's welfare, their schooling, their education, their living arrangements, their overall well-being. So a dad's really going to be hands-on with every aspect of development of their children, raising their children. Whether that means going to court. So for myself, well, we share custody with my sons, the mothers, but my daughters, they live under my roof since little.
And how
For
does
first,
that go work out? How does you having daughters under your roof? Because I know when it's come on to female stuff, right? And since the dad, okay, daddy, it's feel weird telling your dad about certain female stuff. How do you handle that? And not the mom not being there. How does they work with that? And what drove you to have your daughters and not living with the mom. How did that system come into play?
Well, because the mother and I weren't seeing eye to eye on certain living arrangements or things about school and education. So we were, had some differences within those sorts of things. And then obviously the welfare came in and tried to take me to court for child support. So it started from that, which I never actually intended on going to court at no time. That wasn't my first objective to do so. But now that I'm in this fight, I want to make sure that they understand that this fight is not just for myself. It's the right to be in my children's lives. I obtained a lawyer, and that's what I suggest all men to do in those cases. Never go to court without a lawyer, without some representation, and not a legal aid, neither. And if you can't really find the money to obtain a lawyer, there's other ways, that you can get a lawyer, but you want to go in there with some legal representation that's going to represent you well. You know what I mean? So, and in doing so, you want to keep all your documents of things that you are doing as a father, as a dad, whether it's going to buy ice cream, whether it's going to get glasses or going to the doctors. And then you want to build relationships with those individuals, the schools and the doctors, because you want them to know that you're actively involved. You know what I mean? And in doing so, you can now always go back and get references from them to state that, they did see me actively involved with the school or the doctors and childcare and stuff like that when it comes to now going to court. Because the court's really not going to look at you as a primary. They're looking at you as, they're not going to do that. I was even asked by the judge, well, why do I want my children? And I said, well, and then they're going to tell you to refer your answers to your attorney, to your representation. So you really want to get an opportunity to speak to the judge directly. So you always want to speak through your lawyers. And I had to tell my lawyer, well, to tell them the purpose of me being here is because I love them. You know what I mean? Right. There is no other reason. I'm actively involved, and I want to make sure that my children understand that they do have support on this end by all means necessary. You know what I mean?
But do you think that it was systematically designed to have especially minority kids as dad walk away from their kids? Because what you're telling me, the judge is like, why you want your kids? I feel like if it the reverse role, it wouldn't been asked that question. Do you think that the system is just designed to show that minority dad are not in their kids' life, whether they Black, Spanish, whatever, minority people, they father absences. And when the father is fighting the system can't understand why would a minority dad want to fight for their children.
Well, they're designed to break the homes up because their fathers are the strong entity. The fathers could actually break or make a family. And they know that. So, of course, when you're now in the fight and the struggle for your children and for the rights of your children, they're going to look at you totally different. They will request, the means of how you're taking care of your children. They will ask for your living arrangements for the child. They will come in your home and search if you have adequate food and stuff like that. Or do they have their own bed? And so they're going to ask those sorts of things. There's a slew of reasons why they wouldn't really expect or want men to be primaries or have the actual fortitude to be in their child's life. They would prefer us to just walk away and then use us as the resource for finances, putting us through child support and all those sorts of things. They would demand that from us, but they wouldn't demand us being in their child's life. I really don't understand that process. They could take money from us, to pay the child support, but they wouldn't demand us to be directly involved in the child's life. I kind of find that to be
There
ironic.
need to be a change in the system when it's
Cool.
on to instead of child support. If the dad is being actively involved in the kid's life and want to be in the kid's life, demand them. No, it's not just about financial gain. It's about being present. It's about showing up.
Back.
Right. So we need a systematic change. But then we think that there should be a law in place for that. And why should they have to put a law in place for minority? Because they know this is going to direct the minority man, right? Being involved in the kid's life. Why should that be a thing where we have to put something in place to tell minority men that we need you to be a part of your kid's life? Do you think that should be voluntarily automatic? Like, listen.
Well, that should come from the man, actually. You should have a law to be placed in to tell you that, you should be act. Now, if they decide to be in a child's life and now they're getting resistance from the parent, from the other's parent, then those sorts of laws would be beneficial. But that necessarily has to come from the man's heart, from the man's, from his well-being to say that this is what he wants to be a part of. It's easy to make the children now, but the hardest thing to do is to raise them. You know what I mean? And to be actively involved. Making them is the fun times. But now that they're here, you have other things that you have to actually, be mindful of, which is the best situation for the child. And if that means for the child to be with the father, fine. That doesn't exclude the mother from her duties. That doesn't exclude the mother from, still being a part of the child's life. That just means now the father may be a little more stable in his position and the child needs to be there, whether it's educational purposes or living arrangements. Those sorts of things are prudent in a child's upbringing, So with me, my children still had free range to be a part of their mother's life. The mother had a chance to be a part of their life. They would go to her on the weekends. And then for school, she will be able to pick them up after school on a Friday and then spend her weekends with them and bring them back to school on Monday. But, those are choices that the mother will also have to be in agreement with as well. You know what I mean? And sometimes, the children might not understand it because they're young, but the judge, now that, they get all the information as far as their living arrangements, the other parents' living arrangements, the means of how they're taking care of the children. Once the judge get all that information, they make the decision or where they think the child will be best suited to be. You know what I mean? Right. It wasn't an easy call, but once the judges saw that I was consistent in my role and persistent with my role, finally they said, well, the best place for the children to be is with me during the time that they're in school. Doesn't mean that the mother was wrong or had anything going on with herself. You know what I mean? And that's what sometimes people always think, oh, the mother must be on drugs or the mother must be. And it has nothing to do with that. The mother wasn't on drugs. The mother was very well off as far as, sound mind. She had her place and stuff like that. It was just about making sure that the children were in the best situation that the judges now thought they should be in. I didn't initiate the courts in this process. It was brought upon to me, but I stood my ground. You see what I'm saying? Right. And I didn't allow, the child support to run me off or say, well, forget it, or now decide because now welfare had got involved in and looking for me for child support. I didn't run off. I think
When you got custody, how did welfare play? Now, did they stop the case? Did they cut it? How did welfare? You still have to pay.
that wasn't on my end. Whatever happened with that with the mother, I had no dealings with. The
Okay.
welfare, the welfare came from that end.
Right. I
Yeah.
know it came from that.
Right.
And they're the one that went after you for child support, right? This is why a lot of men think that the female put them in child support, but not knowing that child support comes once the female is getting help from the state. And
Fact.
you find that birth certificate. The child
Right.
support, the state is gonna go after you automatically. The female
Right.
have to do it, but in a lot of men, they like, she put me in child support. No, I'm not
No.
saying you don't, but you gotta check where it's coming from. If that mother
Exactly.
needs help from the state,
Exactly.
any form of help, whether it's food stamp, cash assistance, rent, Medicaid, any form of state help, they go and ask
Right.
you for it.
Right.
Right,
Because
they want their money back.
they want their money back. Exactly.
Right.
You know what I
And
mean?
then-
Once the children came to my custody, I don't know how that played out with them on that end. You know what I mean? But they know I wasn't receiving any of those benefits, so those sorts of things to take care of my children. I didn't need those benefits because I was always working. I always had a source of means to take care of my children, whereas their medical was paid and, made sure that they had adequate schooling. And at the time I was playing parochial school. My children went to parochial school. So, and that's another thing. That's not mandatory that they have to go to Catholic school. You know what I mean? But if you choose to put your children through parochial school, you are required to pay that. And I was willing to do that. That wasn't something that I thought that was a punishment or, no, that was something I wanted to make sure and provide my children with the best resources of education possible. And I thought that would be the way to go for me, for them. They finished school. So I was pleased with that. And, they stayed here till they graduated high school. I had my children here since high school, from first grade to 12th grade. So, we going through all the graduations and the plays, the teachers' meetings. And yeah, I was doing all of that. And I would still implement and call their mom and let their mom know that these are things that's going on. She was never excluded from Thanksgivings and Christmases. We would share those holidays as well. You know what I mean? We would share all the holidays. They would stay here during the day and then she'll pick them up in the afternoon or whatever. But I was primary. So they would stay here during the week, school and all of that. Made sure that school was top priority. I want to make sure that they get the best education possible.
So how do you handle when they sick at school? Did you have a support team? How do you handle when school are out? When it comes on to, childcare?
Well, I had my mom. My mom and my family was a great source of support. One thing, it takes a village to raise a child. I didn't do it by myself. My mom and I had my family members who may have picked my children up sometime when I was at work or couldn't get to them at the time because I was at work. You know what I mean? So, you have to make provisions. You got to make arrangements that's going to be suitable for your child as well and not put so much pressure on anyone. These individuals that are willing to help you out are willing participants. These are individuals, family members who are willing to give you a source of support, and it doesn't always have to be a financial thing behind it. They want to see the children and you receive the best support possible so they could actually get the best resources out of the support themselves. When you have great resources and your family members are behind you or stand beside you, not behind you. They were right there. It makes it a little easier. You still burden all the responsibilities to make sure that they get on school on time, make sure that they don't miss no days. You make sure that they need to go to their doctors when need to be. Make sure they go to their dentist. Make sure they go to the eye doctor. So all those appointments and stuff like that, I had to make sure and get to those appointments with the children. Now, if there was a time where I needed the mother to, step in, I would always reach out to her and ask her, was she available? Never ever excluding her from any of the duties that she had as well as a mother. Never excluding her at no time. Because it wasn't never about excluding the mother. But see, when mothers get the custody, they sometimes like to exclude the fathers from all duties. Yeah, they like to do that. And I think that's wrong within itself. With me, I never tried to ever exclude the mother from ever having a relationship or having information about doctors and schooling and things like that. Never kept her out, always kept her in the loop pertaining to the children.
That's good. So what would you say to young fathers that feel like that don't have the money to go to court to say, okay, I want to get custody of my kids, that don't have the resources and the family support that you have? What would you say to those dads that really want to be in their kids' life, really want to be there for the kids? What the message would you send to those young men or those men?
Well, I would tell them, first of all, they can't be emotional. They have to come through with some strategy. And the strategy means you have to sit down and have a conversation. And sometimes it may be hard to do that with the individual that you had the child with, if you are at odds with each other. But you have to find a medium. So if you could find someone who could talk to the mother, you want to be able to talk with some sense and not yelling and calling names. And for the young men, it's very important to keep your emotions intact. How could you be tactical if you are emotional? Those two things will never then work out because now you're dealing from a place, of feelings versus a place of logic. Right. And you want to be able to come in with some logic when you're speaking to the mother, because you also have to remember the children still do love their mother regardless. And sometimes they might even love their mothers slightly more than. And I understand that too, because the mother did carry the child. You know what I mean? So they're emotional attachment is totally different from the emotional attachment with the fathers. You have to be mindful of how you speak to the mother, how you convey your messages to the mother, and especially not ever in front of the child. You don't want to create a hostile environment in front of your child, because now they're going to look at you with scary thoughts and scary visions of you being this mean guy, not a dad. And if you're speaking to the mother that way, or treating the mother in a way that's not appealing, of course, you're not going to get the benefit of any doubt. You're going to always be looked upon as the bad guy.
Right.
So I try to tell young men, try to keep your emotions intact. And if you can't do so at that given time, walk away. Say, well, we'll convene this message another time when you get your emotions back intact, and then you'll come back to speak to another day. But don't blow up. Try to keep yourself from becoming an emotional stress to yourself and to the situation. Because now you're really not going to be thinking clearly. And if you don't have the money or the means, this is where you now go to. Sometimes, believe it or not, you might have to go to welfare yourself, and don't be ashamed to do that. It was a time where I needed to maybe get some food stamps, and yeah, I had to do it. That didn't mean I wanted to, but sometimes as men, we have to do things that we really don't want to make sure that we get the things that we need. And so that might be another resource for you to do so. Go to welfare. Tell them, listen, this is the situation I'm in. I need some food stamps. Also, I'm looking for legal assistance, with my situation. Those will be a couple of resources. And then they also have some lawyers out here who's willing to take on cases like that free, right? Because what happens is that case builds up their actual firm and their company and stuff like that as well, taking on black men's, situations in the court systems, knowing that, we don't really get the just due when we're in those situations as well. So you may have some firms that's willing to take upon some information and represent you as well.
And when it comes on to jobs, right? I know black men may say, no, I have a felon, I have this, I've been in and out of jail, I'm not gonna get no job. I'm a felon, so who's gonna hire me? What would you say?
Right. Well, I'll say everything starts with speaking it into existence. You can't continuously just say that you're a felon if you're no longer in prison. That's something that happened. Yeah, that's something that's might be on your record. But if you continuously speak that, that's what people will see. You have to now speak things into existence. I'm a firm believer in that. Be mindful of how you represent yourself, right? And
Mhm.
so if you're looking for a job, and it could be in McDonald's, it could be at the Bronx Zoo. Never be too prideful to take a job, because the job doesn't display who you are. Your character would do so. That one job that you think is beneath you might could lead you to getting something else better, depending on how you then come into that job and do your job effectively, being on time and stuff like that. You have to crawl before you walk,
Right.
right? You can't go to a job wanting to be a manager right off the bat without no experience.
And what do you say about those that are working, have it, and feel like they have no me time for themselves? Because I know a lot of us mothers, we sacrifice all our personal going out or socializing with adults. What do you say about men that feel like I have no me time for myself? I can't do this.
There's always going to be times that you will feel that way, but the children will go to school 24/7, right? That's one. They do have times on the weekends where you can actually do things with the children that will also give you some opportunities to do things as well. So, going to the zoo and things that you may not consider to be at the time, you know, things that adults do, but you can find other men to do that with together, right? So, you and your man, you have to take the children out to the park together while the children play around. That's your me time. When the children go to sleep, you have your me time as well. As the children are away on the weekends, then you can always squeeze in some time for yourself. Going to the gym, working out in the park, you riding your bike. There is always an opportunity for you to do so, because you have to be able to break the monotony of being a parent every day, right? You have to make sure that you recharge yourself as well. Find a hobby. whether it's reading a book, taking a walk, going to botanical gardens. Sometimes the simplest things could be so rewarding, and so peaceful that those sorts of things can charge. You don't necessarily have to always be in a high value place like a club or a party, to say I need some me time.
They say
Me
when
time,
they
right?
keep a man when they feel burnt out, when they feel overwhelmed, just unwind, take a walk, read a book, something. It's outdoors.
Yeah,
Sit outside,
yeah,
something.
yeah. Those things you could do that, and but sometimes men feel like, well, that's, it's not it's not active, or you have to be in the mix of something in order to feel like you doing something. Sometimes the best time is the quiet time. The best time is to be by
Hey,
yourself.
yep.
That way you can really start to think and recharge and say to yourself, well, this is more important, or this take more priority than me being in the club or spending unnecessary money on drinks and stuff like that. You know what I mean? You can find yourself being so much more peaceful, and you have a better clarity of how you can now be the best dad you can be to your children, because you already are recharging yourself.
Right.
Very
Right.
important.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. And then any final thought you want to leave before we go?
I just want the young men to know, all men to know that, where there's a will, there is a way. So you must be able to, speak your truth into existence, one, and make sure that you understand that you have the power. The tongue is very powerful, right? So you want to speak all those good things about yourself. Affirmations are good. I am a good dad. I am a good father. Make sure you continuously speak those things. And then you have to display it. Not only to show it, you have to display it as well. See, love is an action word. So you just can't say you love something without actually displaying the actual what is love. So you have to be able to show it on the physical as well. And physical doesn't necessarily mean being aggressive. It could be a kind word. You could show compassion for others, your kind thoughts. All those sorts of things, man, now builds up character of the man.
One thing I have to ask you, right? Us girls, we look up to our dad, to the kind of man that we wanna marry, right? For
Right.
fathers that have daughters, what do you say? And for fathers that have boys, what would you say to them?
Well, for me, I don't separate the two, right? So I would give my sons the same information I would give my daughters. You're not having girlfriends early. Be mindful of the women that you do encounter. You just don't want to plant your seeds all over. I tell my sons that as well. Multiple women don't make you a man. I tell my daughters, boys like pretty girls, but most importantly, they don't like dumb girls. So, you can always have time to be a husband or a boyfriend, but get your education. Make sure that you have something on top, because those are the things that will be able to keep a man, not your body, because those things will start to deteriorate as you get older. You want to be able to still be able to hold a man. Having a man is one thing. Knowing how to keep him is another. Same thing with my sons. Having a girlfriend is one thing, but knowing how to keeping her is another. And if you're not fulfilling yourself, how can you fulfill somebody else? So, you know what I mean? So those sorts of
So
things are really important.
okay, so those are the words that you said dads should tell their thing, but it goes by action too. It's the way they act around, like earlier you said, the way you treat your mother, they look at,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the
yeah,
type of man you are, like, right now,
right,
you look at my dad is always there. So they're gonna look for a husband that's always there,
right,
show up when times are. And that's the most important that a dad has to play his role, like show up, be there.
right,
But
right.
that your daughter is looking at the type of husband she want to marry in the future, and your son is gonna look at you as the type of man that you want to be in the future, right?
Yeah,
Don't be that
right.
man that your daughter looking like I would never marry someone like you, or your son
Exactly.
be like I would never be like you, and go
Yeah,
the good
exactly.
way,
Right. See,
right?
I love my mother. I love my mother immensely, and I respect her to the fullest. You know what I mean? So, those sorts of things. Your sons see that, they know how to treat women. Your daughters see that, they know how to be expected to be treated.
Right.
Because my dad speaks to his mother with respect. My dad, honors his mother. I don't care what type of parent you have. You know, a child will never be blessed if they're being disrespectful to their parents. As for me, that's something that will never ever come through in my life being disrespectful to my mother. My mother and I had disagreements, of course. How do you settle disagreements with your parents? One, you don't forget that they are your parent. So, be mindful of what you say and how you say things. You could disagree with your parents as well. You have that right to do that,
Right.
right? But it's how you convey your messages across to your mom, how you convey your messages when you're angry. Because when you say words that are hurtful, remember, you can't take them back. Only thing you can do is apologize. So
Right.
be mindful of the words you speak. Very, very important. You
Amen.
know?
Well, Troy, I want to thank you for taking this moment out and thank you for coming in Childcare Challenges and delivering daycare. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And again, guys, like, share, subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you. All right, Troy.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me and make it a great day. For sure. We have the ability to do so. Don't have a great day. Make it a great day.
Make it a great day.
Make it a great day.